Hi, British literature students. Welcome to the first module. This is where we're going to start discussing the idea of literary theory. So when we read anything, but especially a piece of literature, there are certain ways that we can approach it and begin to interpret it with some creativity and with some critical analysis. As I've mentioned earlier in this particular module, is it possible to read a piece of literature and just enjoy it for a good story? Absolutely. Is it possible just to read a piece of literature because it's fun? Absolutely. But it's also possible to read a piece of literature and look at it through particular lenses and start asking some questions of it to kind of glean out of it some other interpretations. That's the beautiful thing about literature, is that it presents us this piece of art that can have many interpretations and many different ways of analyzing it. Now, this doesn't mean that the author wrote this piece of literature specifically with that idea in mind. That's not really the point. We're not trying to figure out what the author was thinking. We can say, the author presents this character, the author presents this idea, here's maybe an interpretation of it. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, well, that's what the author was thinking, because that's not really the point of art of any sort. Painting, music, drama, dance, what the songwriter may have been thinking about a song when they wrote it might not be what it means to you. So that's exactly what interpreting literature is about. So I want to walk through, just in a really little nutshell, a few of the literary theories that I think will be useful for the particular literature that we'll be reading. There are many more literary theories than this, and if you choose to pursue a degree in English, you will probably run into literary theory more past this. Especially if you go to graduate school, you'll have entire classes on literary theory. So let's take a look. I'm going to walk through a PowerPoint that I'm also posting below this video so that you've got access to it both ways. You can look at the PowerPoint individually and just use the information on the slides, and you can use this lecture video as well. Okay, so let me get things switched around. So I want to first of all establish what literary theory is not. So it's not finding a hidden message, like the meme here shows. It's not trying to be cutesy or trying to be overly analytical. We're not trying to find out what the author meant. And of course, there is no one true meaning, and very little literature is written to kind of have a moral to the story. Some fables and fairy tales are written that way, but for the vast majority of literature, there's not like a lesson to be learned. Although there may be things that we interpret in the literature that are good lessons that we should learn, that's not really the point of interpreting the literature. So what is it? It's looking at art. That's really what literary theory is all about. So it's saying this piece of literature is a piece of art. And so what I bring to this piece of art, the questions I want to ask of it, the way that I want to make connections within it is perfectly valid as long as I'm using what's in the literature itself. So it's an interaction that I can take with the literature. It's a relationship with the literature. I can look at the context around the literature. I can look at the culture that the writer grew up in and that the writer is writing about. I can look at the ways the writer decided to tell the story or to write the poem. So there are all kinds of different ways that I can begin to look at this piece of art and interpret it. There's not just the one right way. So we're going to look at these four: psychoanalytic, feminist, Marxist, and historicism. As I said before, there are many more theories than this. We're just going to be using these four. So let's walk through them kind of individually. Psychoanalytic theory finds its roots kind of where modern psychology finds its roots, which is with the theories of Sigmund Freud. We know in our kind of greater understanding of human psychology that some of the clinical practices that Freud used, we've kind of found some flaws in those. And so most counselors and therapists and clinicians don't base their work in Freudian psychology. However, Freud's theories of the mind and how the human psyche is put together is still incredibly useful, both in psychology, but also in literature. This becomes a really interesting lens to use to look at what we will read. So some key elements that we might use when we interpret the literature. First of all, the unconscious mind. So this is the part that's sort of running in the background. If we compare the mind to a computer, this is like software that's running in the background. I don't see it on my computer screen. I don't really have to interact with it in any way, but it's actually controlling what the computer does. Same thing with the unconscious mind. It's running in the background and it still controls kind of what we do. It's very powerful influence on our actions and our decisions, and it changes over time depending on what we experience. Repression is another interesting Freudian idea, that we as humans have this tendency to pack down and press down negative experiences. We tend to repress them rather than deal with them or express them. They will inevitably bubble up in some way. This is an interesting one, for example, for Frankenstein, because Victor Frankenstein has some traumatic experiences in his past. And we could look at his desire to create this creature as an expression of what he has repressed, these traumatic memories. Sublimation is something that takes this repressed idea or repressed material and creates it into something grand or noble. So the example I give here are, for example, if we repress sexual desires because we've been told they're wrong or we shouldn't have them, often they get expressed in a different way. They may be expressed with religious experience or with the need to rescue others, that kind of idea. That's sublimation, where we take something that we've been told is negative or should be repressed and we express it in a different way. The other important piece of Freud that's useful in literature is the three-part model of the psyche. The ego is yourself. It's your consciousness. It's your aware self. It's the way you interact with the world. It's the way you present yourself to the world. So this is the part of yourself that kind of understands the culture you live in and knows how to interact with it. The superego is basically our conscience. It's our sense of right and wrong. It's what keeps us in control, right? Rather than just acting on every impulse or acting only in self-interest. The superego, according to Freud, is what regulates us and helps us stay within sort of the bounds of our society or our culture. And then the id is our unconscious. It is the part that is driven in us by pleasure. And Freud used this idea of the pleasure principle. So the id is this very primitive part of us that just runs on instinct. And if we didn't have the superego to keep us in control, the id would just explode and take over, and things could be incredibly chaotic. So think about Freud this way, and psychoanalytic this way, that there's a way of understanding the reasons characters behave the way they do, right? So we could use some of these ideas from Freud to say, well, let's take a look at Victor Frankenstein, for example. Here's how we see his id expressed. Or this is the creature. And this is how we see the creature does have a superego. The creature has this ability to understand right and wrong. So we can use these as ways of getting into these characters and ways of sort of taking that to then put the literature together in this very interpretive, analytical way. So that's psychoanalytic theory. Another theory that is closely related to psychoanalytic theory, is, if I can get my slide to move, feminist theory. So feminist theory takes the idea that the ideas that sort of are rooted in feminist movements, the earliest being in the 18th century. We're actually going to read one of the very early feminists, Mary Wollstonecraft. And it basically says, all right, let's look at this piece of literature and let's look at the women in it. Let's look at the female characters. How are they presented? How do they show us what is considered appropriate feminine behavior? Or what does this piece of literature show is legitimate for women? So if we look at a piece of literature and it shows a woman who is highly opinionated and then the woman dies, we can use feminist theory to take a look at that and say, wow, that's an interesting picture of the feminine and what it means to be a female in this context. So a couple things that feminist theory should kind of guide us towards and some of the key questions. What is feminine in this literature? So in other words, what does it mean? What is the construction of what feminine means? Does it mean to be submissive? Does it mean to be quiet? Does it mean to be following the rules? There are some interesting feminist questions, for example, that we can ask of Frankenstein, that we can look at in terms of Oscar Wilde's play that we're going to read, The Importance of Being Earnest. The female characters in that are very fascinating. We can also, of course, look at it in our more modern literature when we get to the 20th century, and especially when we start looking at song lyrics, this idea of relationship and the feminine. So some key questions. What does this literature reveal about what it means to be a woman? What do the female characters say, or what do they do? Like, what makes up their activity or their person? How is language used to the woman, or how is language used by the woman? So how do the women act or speak? And then how do the other characters act or speak in relationship to them? So this isn't saying, this isn't the feminist kind of idea like men are bad, or whatever, because that's not even feminism. This is simply saying we're going to take a special focus on the female characters in this piece of literature to begin to understand how this literature presents what it means to be feminine or what it means to be a woman. Another type of theory is Marxist theory. This is, as the name implies, based upon the political and economic theories of Karl Marx. So Marx himself, just in a nutshell, thought that the ideal society should be classless, meaning that everyone should be on the same level. There's common ownership, there's common use of goods, and that everyone is involved and benefits from every stage of the economy. So the production of goods, the distribution of goods, and the wealth that comes from selling those goods, that we should all participate in all stages. So this means Marx saw capitalism as the basis of a society that divides itself then up into classes. And because of that fragmentation, there is no possibility for the lower classes to enjoy the same benefits that the upper classes do. The lower class does all of the work, the lower class does all of the productivity, but the upper class is what benefits from all of that work. So the upper class doesn't actually do the work, but they benefit from it. So to Marx, that structure is inherently flawed. And so his ideas have to do with who has the power in the society, who controls production, and who controls benefits from the exchange. So here's how we can use it in literature. First of all, it asserts that the author and that author's social class kind of inherently affects the literature. So if this author is from the upper class, this author may view society in a completely different way than an author who may have been from a lower class. This author may use language differently, or this author may depict class differently than those from a lower class. And then the literature itself may show Marxist ideas. So who in this piece of literature is in control? Who has the power to make decisions? Who's the one producing what is considered the goods in this literature? Who demands that power or those goods? And then an interesting question, what in this piece of literature is being consumed or being purchased or being bought? And who is it that does the consuming? So that again is sort of a power differential idea. The final theory, and this is one kind of where I start every interpretation of the literature, is known as historicism or new historicism. So historicism and new historicism both say looking at a piece of literature also requires looking at the period or the history in which it was written. So there's no way to fully understand the literature without understanding the historical context, like what was going on in England during the time that this literature was being written. So understanding that gives us a new lens. New historicism says, yes, let's do that, but let's also look at other documents or other contexts within that same time period and put them side by side with the literature so they can add a dimension to the literature that we may miss if we didn't know the history of that time. Stephen Greenblatt, he's the editor of your textbook. He is considered the guy for new historicism. He pioneered it. So in your textbook, when you read the introductory material to each period, so you'll read the beginning of the Romanticism chapter. It has all kinds of background on what was going on during this period. That's Stephen Greenblatt. He's writing that to give you the background for what was going on for these pieces of literature. So how can we use historicism? Well, here's an example. Let's say we were reading one of Shakespeare's comedies. We're not going to because that's a different period of time. But if we were, we can say, okay, Shakespeare's comedies are almost always based on relationship between a man and a woman, often involving mistaken identity and all kinds of humor based around relationships. So if we were to use new historicism or historicism to understand that, we would go, okay, so let's look at the time period that Shakespeare lived, which is 1564 to 1616. What was going on during that time period in regards to relationships? What does a marriage document look like? What were laws regarding marriage and relationship between man and woman? What were the church documents about marriage during Shakespeare's life? So we can use those very nonfiction, historical kinds of documents and ideas and use them to interpret what Shakespeare is writing about relationships or about marriage and men and women. So doing literary theory, so how do we use these? So if I am to read a piece of literature and then go, okay, I've got these characters, I've got this story, I've got this idea. So how do I use these to actually do theory or how to analyze the literature? A couple of different ways. First of all, realize that these theories are just ways of getting into the literature. We might not use them for every piece of literature. Every theory doesn't necessarily apply to every piece of literature. So these are just tools. They're just options to try to get down into the literature. Because like the TARDIS and Doctor Who, it's bigger on the inside. There are always these ways of getting through the door and then opening up or unlocking the world of the literature itself. And that's what these theories help us do. We will, of course, look at the symbolism and the theme and the big question ideas that you're kind of used to doing literature, if you remember in high school or other literature classes. But these theories add another layer and another set of tools. So how can we use them? Well, first of all, it allows us to ask many, many questions of the literature and to make these big connections across various fields. We can connect literature to history. We can connect literature to economics and sociology. We can connect literature to psychology. So there are all these different ways that now we're kind of exploding the literature so that we can see inside of it. So how to approach the literature. So I like to think of it in terms of kind of like these stages. So the 0 stage is just simply understanding what you read. Who are the characters? What's the plot? What happens? So that's the most basic understanding of reading. So that's the 0 level. Moving into a more particular level is the noticing. So notice the details. Notice the characters. Notice what stands out. Notice what they're saying. Notice the time period, right? So then you start going, all right, so what do I need to pay attention to? And then level 2 is then going, all right, we have the details. Let's explain them. Let's use one of these theories to put them all together and to interpret them. Or let's use one of these theories to start asking questions about this detail I found, about this character, or about what they do in the story itself. So this is a particular way that we can move into the literature and really open up this vast world of being able to talk about this literature. So for the rest of this module, you are going to have a chance to use these literary theories in interpreting a very popular, very common children's book. It's The Giving Tree, which obviously you can see if you've scrolled down at all in this module. So it's a story that's probably familiar to most of us. If not, I've posted the text of the story and I've posted a video of the story, which is basically the story being read and the animations are the drawings from the book that are animated. Take some time to read it. So go through those levels of reading. Understand, first of all, just who's in this story and what happens. Notice the details, both in the words and in the pictures. And then let's use the literary theories to see if we can start to interpret those details or ask questions about them. So your discussion board is going to ask you to think about those literary theories, to write about one, to apply it to the literature, and then to discuss with someone who wrote about a different literary theory than you did, about how that other theory can also help us ask questions about the literature. So if you get to the discussion board and you notice that everyone has written about like feminism, pick something else. Everyone cannot write about the same literary theory. So all 4 of these work really well with this children's book. They all apply in one way or another. So I look forward to seeing how you use these theories to interpret this book and to analyze it and think about it in maybe new ways that you hadn't thought about it before. And then we'll move into the literature starting next week. And we'll still kind of keep this same literary theory way of interpreting the literature itself. All right, have a good week. I look forward to reading your discussion boards.